I'd poured everything into finding my lost sister, Maggie, for nearly 60 years. My fortune, my heart, relentless searches across 4 states, dead ends everywhere. Then Margaret Bates, the owner of the Daily Grind, whose property I'd tried to buy for years, hummed a familiar, almost forgotten lullaby. The very same unique tune my mother Alice sang only to me and my little sister when we were children in Atlanta back in '68. My breath hitched. My world stopped cold. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. The faint scent of aged paper and old leather always filled Dorothy Henderson's private study, a smell that had become as comforting as it was heartbreaking. This wasn't her impressive downtown office with its sweeping views of Atlanta, nor her elegant Buckhead living room. This was the Maggie room, as she sometimes silently called it, the true heart of her empire, where every success, every property acquisition, every deal closed, funneled back to one singular purpose: finding her sister. Maps of Georgia, then the Carolinas, then a wider swath of the Southeast, were tacked to corkboards, crisscrossed with colored string and faded pins. Manila folders, hundreds of them, filled a custom-built cabinet, each labeled with a name, a city, a dead end. Private investigator reports, thick as phone books, detailed fruitless searches for a woman named Margaret, or Maggie, adopted from a children's home in Atlanta back in 1968. Dorothy was 68 now. Margaret would be 64. A lifetime had passed since she last saw her little sister's face. She remembered the day she found the journal. Her mother, Alice, had passed peacefully in her sleep at 88, finally free from the grief that had shadowed her for decades. Tucked deep in her cedar chest, hidden beneath decades of family keepsakes, was a small, worn leather book. Inside, Alice's shaky, tear-stained handwriting revealed the agonizing truth. In 1968, after their father died, and Alice was left destitute and ill, she had placed 4-year-old Maggie for adoption. Not with distant relatives, as Dorothy had been told, but with strangers, through a children's home in Atlanta. A crudely drawn map marked the spot, and Alice's desperate plea echoed from the page. "Find my little bird, my Maggie, and tell her I loved her every single day." Dorothy had been 10, still a child herself, when her world shattered the first time. Finding that journal shattered it again, but this time it also lit a fire. That was 20 years ago. 20 years of relentless searching, pouring millions into agencies, ancestry sites, and private eyes. Friends, even her loyal assistant, Carol, had long since stopped asking if she'd heard anything. They'd learned to just offer a kind, sad glance when a new lead fizzled out. Dorothy saw their pity, but she couldn't give up. Maggie was out there. She had to be. Every morning, without fail, Carol would walk across the alley and bring back Dorothy's usual black coffee from the Daily Grind. It was a good little shop, always bustling, smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. Margaret Bates, the owner, was a pleasant enough woman, always neat, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Dorothy knew Margaret mostly as the stubborn woman who owned the building right next to her newest corporate offices. She'd made several generous offers to buy the Daily Grind property over the years, wanting to expand. Margaret always politely, but firmly, refused. "It's my life's work, Ms. Henderson," she'd said once. "It's not for sale." Dorothy respected her grit, even if it frustrated her business plans. Just last week, another lead had collapsed. A Maggie Smith, born in Georgia in 1964, adopted in Ohio. Dorothy had felt that familiar surge of hope, followed by the slow, painful deflation. The woman had been very kind on the phone, but her adoption records clearly stated she was an only child, and her birth mother's name wasn't Alice. Another Maggie who wasn't her Maggie. Dorothy had hung up, staring blankly at the map of Ohio, slowly pulling the pin out, The hole it left felt like a fresh wound. She carefully placed the file back in its cabinet, the soft thud a mournful echo in the quiet room. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing a 4-year-old girl with bright, curious eyes, humming a forgotten tune. "Don't give up, Alice," she told herself. "Don't give up on your little bird." The search continued. It always would. Another dead end. The email from the agency landed in Dorothy's inbox like a lead weight, confirming that the Margaret Johnson they'd tracked down in northern Ohio was indeed not her Maggie. Not the right age, not the right adoption details. It was the 5th such disappointment in as many months, each one leaving a fresh bruise on her already weary heart. The meticulous maps in her study, once vibrant with hopeful pins, now seemed like a mournful tapestry of dashed hopes. Her patience, usually an endless reservoir for complex real estate deals, had thinned to a fragile thread. These days, the smallest thing could unravel her. Her assistant, Carol, bore the brunt of it, quietly enduring Dorothy's sharp tone over a misplaced file or a scheduling mix-up that wasn't even Carol's fault. "Honestly, Carol, are you even paying attention anymore?" Dorothy had snapped that morning, her voice echoing a little too harshly in the quiet office. Carol just offered a tight-lipped apology, her shoulders a little more slumped than usual. Even the morning coffee, a ritual she usually cherished, felt off. "This coffee is lukewarm again," Dorothy declared, pushing the mug away after just one sip. "Didn't I mention this yesterday, Carol? Tell Margaret to pay attention. It's not that hard to keep coffee hot." Carol, bless her heart, simply nodded. "I'll go right back, Ms. Henderson. I'm so sorry." Dorothy watched her cross the small alley toward the daily grind, feeling a pang of guilt, but unable to retract her words. The frustration of the search, the decades of longing had curdled inside her, making her irritable and demanding. It wasn't fair to Carol or to Margaret, but the ache in her chest felt like a constant dull throb. And sometimes the only way to alleviate it was to lash out at something tangible. A few days later, Dorothy found herself walking toward the daily grind herself. Carol was out sick with a nasty cold, and Dorothy, despite her impatience, felt a twinge of concern. It meant she had to fetch her own coffee, a rare event. The aroma of cinnamon and roasted beans embraced her as she stepped inside. The shop was quieter than usual, a gentle hum of conversation and the soft clinking of cups. Margaret Bates, with her usual neat apron and kind eyes, was wiping down the counter. "Well, Miss Henderson, a surprise to see you in person," Margaret greeted, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "The usual black coffee?" Dorothy nodded, trying to soften her usual brusque demeanor. "Please, Margaret. And maybe a blueberry scone, if you have any fresh ones." "Coming right up," Margaret said, her movements efficient and graceful. As she turned to fetch the scone, she sighed softly, a little sound of weariness. "It's been one of those days, you know. Just a string of little things going wrong. Makes me feel like a kid again, needing a good calming down." She chuckled lightly. "My adoptive mom, bless her heart, had this one special lullaby she'd sing. Always worked like a charm, even if I was a grown 4-year-old by then." And then, almost to herself, Margaret hummed a few bars. The tune was soft, a little off-key, but utterly distinct. It was a melody Dorothy hadn't heard in decades, a unique, slightly obscure tune. Her breath caught, a tiny, involuntary hitch in her chest. For a split second, an image flashed in her mind. Her mother, Alice, rocking a small child, singing that very song. Dorothy herself, a little girl, listening from her own bed in their small Atlanta home. It was just a flicker, quickly dismissed. Her mind, so consumed with her sister's whereabouts, probably just connecting to any old lullaby it heard, she reasoned. It was a common enough tune, probably. She shook her head slightly, bringing herself back to the bustling coffee shop. "Oh," Dorothy managed, her voice a little more clipped than she intended. Interesting. My mother used to sing one too, a long time ago. She quickly changed the subject. How are the property taxes treating you this quarter, Margaret? Still holding out on my offer? Margaret handed her the scone and coffee, her smile still gentle. Yes, Miss Henderson. Still holding out. This place means too much to me. She looked at Dorothy, a hint of something deeper in her gaze. A quiet understanding that seemed to see past Dorothy's sharpness to the guarded vulnerability underneath. It wasn't the look a shop owner gives a demanding customer. It was something akin to a silent empathy, a shared knowing, though Dorothy couldn't fathom what it could be. She just collected her order, mumbled a thanks, and retreated back to her office, the ghost of a lullaby already fading from her thoughts, replaced by the persistent ache of her unending search. The email landed in Dorothy's inbox, not from a private investigator this time, but from an online ancestry database she'd funded for years. The subject line glowed. Potential relative match. Her heart leaped, a feeling so potent it almost buckled her knees. This wasn't just a distant cousin, it was a close genetic link, a predicted half-sister match to the DNA sample she'd submitted under Maggie's assumed birth year. The name attached, Margaret Pruitt, born in 1968, adopted from an Atlanta children's home. Every detail aligned perfectly. The Maggie room, usually a place of quiet contemplation, became a whirlwind. Dorothy barely slept, fueled by cold coffee and a frantic energy. She hired a new, more aggressive private investigator, authorizing a blank check for travel and resources. Phones rang constantly. Carol, her assistant, was tasked with booking flights, coordinating meetings, and sifting through decades-old adoption records. Dorothy was short-tempered, her thoughts completely consumed by this new lead. "Just get it done, Carol," she'd barked. "I don't care what it costs." She even forgot about her coffee order for a couple of days, absorbed in scanning old Atlanta public records for any mention of the Pruitt family, the prospective adoptive parents. When Carol finally put a steaming mug on her desk, Dorothy barely glanced up. "Is it hot this time?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. She hadn't even noticed that Carol had once again walked over to the daily grind. One brisk afternoon, Dorothy found herself impatiently waiting for Carol to return from the coffee run. She paced her office, her mind racing with the possibilities of Margaret Pruitt. Was she tall like their father? Did she have their mother's bright blue eyes? How would she react to learning about a sister after all these years? The door finally opened, and Carol entered, balancing a tray of coffees and pastries. "Ms. Henderson, I ran into Margaret Bates at the Daily Grind," Carol said, trying to make polite conversation as Dorothy snatched her coffee. "She mentioned she's planning a little trip soon, back to North Carolina to visit her adoptive parents. Said they're getting on in years." Dorothy took a large gulp of her coffee, barely registering the words. "Good for her, Carol. Now, did that lawyer from Savannah send over those Pruitt family trust documents yet?" Carol sighed almost imperceptibly, then continued. "She also said she always loved going back to North Carolina. That's where her adoptive parents took her right after they adopted her from the children's home in Atlanta, back in '68. She was only 4, but she still remembers the journey, how excited they were to start their new life together." Dorothy, engrossed in a new stack of documents pertaining to Margaret Pruitt, simply waved her hand dismissively. "That's nice, Carol. Just focus on these papers. We need to confirm everything before I fly out next week." She didn't even glance at Carol, much less process Margaret's casual sharing of her origin story, the one that echoed so uncannily with her own relentless search. Dorothy's world had narrowed to one name: Margaret Pruitt. The trip was booked. Dorothy felt a familiar flutter of hope, tinged with anxiety. This felt different. This felt real. She envisioned the reunion, the tears, the shared stories. She even picked out a small antique locket she planned to give Maggie. a symbolic connection to their shared past. Then the call came. Late one evening, the private investigator, his voice heavy with apology, delivered the crushing news. The Margaret Pruitt in question was adopted in Atlanta in 1968, but her birth certificate listed her mother's maiden name as Thompson, not Henderson. The ancestry match, while strong, was a fluke, a distant familial connection that often happened in smaller communities, not the direct link they'd hoped for. Another Margaret, Ms. Henderson, but not your Maggie. Dorothy sat in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to her ear long after the call ended. The locket lay cold on her desk. The hope, so vibrant just hours before, dissolved into ash. She felt the familiar crushing weight of disappointment, heavier this time. The Maggie room, once a beacon, now felt like a tomb of failed dreams. She picked up the phone, her hand shaking, and called Carol. Cancel the flights. Clear the schedule. It was another mistake. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Another dead end. The search continued, a lonely, endless path. The quiet hum of the air conditioning felt oppressive in Dorothy's office, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. The latest lead, the Margaret Pruitt who seemed so promising, had evaporated like mist. Another name crossed off the list, another, hope extinguished. Dorothy sat at her expansive mahogany desk, but the stacks of property deeds and financial reports blurred before her eyes. The meticulously organized files in her Maggie room now felt less like a testament to her determination and more like a mausoleum of lost chances. She hadn't just lost a sister. She had carried the weight of her mother's dying wish, that desperate plea from the journal, for 2 decades. Find my little bird, my Maggie, and tell her I loved her every single day. Dorothy had promised, silently, fiercely, to fulfill that wish. And now she felt like she was failing, again and again. Carol, ever the faithful shadow, brought in a fresh cup of coffee from the daily grind, placing it gently on a coaster. Ms. Henderson, is there anything else I can do? Carol asked, her voice soft with concern. She had witnessed this cycle of hope and despair countless times. Dorothy just shook her head, staring out of the window at the distant Atlanta skyline, which seemed to mock her with its vastness. No, Carol, there's nothing anyone can do. Another Margaret, another dead end. It's always another Margaret. Her voice was barely a whisper, raw with exhaustion. It's like she just vanished into thin air. A knock at her office door made Dorothy jump slightly. Margaret Bates stood in the doorway, a slight, apologetic smile on her face. Excuse me, Ms. Henderson, I know you're busy, but I just wanted to drop off this updated proposal for the alleyway maintenance, and I saw Carol just leaving, so I figured I'd say hello. Margaret held a neat stack of papers, her usual composed self. She usually sent her own assistant for these things, but today she had brought them herself. Dorothy sighed, running a hand through her perfectly coiffed silver hair. Her usual sharp businesswoman persona had crumbled. She didn't have the energy to discuss property lines or maintenance schedules. Margaret, now's not a good time. Just leave them on Carol's desk. Margaret, however, didn't move immediately. Her kind eyes, usually so observant, softened. Is everything all right, Miss Henderson? You seem troubled. Dorothy rarely let anyone see her vulnerable side, especially not a small business owner she regularly tried to acquire property from. But the dam inside her had broken. The constant ache of loss, the guilt of failure, the sheer weariness of her decades-long search, all bubbled to the surface. She waved a dismissive hand, her gaze still fixed on the horizon, but her voice cracked when she spoke. No, Margaret, everything is far from all right. It's the same old story. Another false hope, another Maggie who isn't my Maggie. I've been searching for 60 years. 60 years, Margaret. Can you imagine that? to know you had a sister, a little girl, and she just disappeared. Margaret shifted, setting the papers down on a nearby table, her posture suddenly a little more still. She didn't interrupt, just listened with an unexpected patience. My mother called her my little bird, Dorothy continued, the words tumbling out, unbidden, from a place she rarely revealed. She was so tiny, always trailing after me. And she had this doll, you see. Not a fancy store-bought doll. Our mama made it for her. A small hand-stitched rag doll. Mama used scraps of fabric, I remember. It had bright red yarn hair all tangled, and the button eyes were mismatched, one bigger than the other, like it was always winking. Maggie wouldn't go anywhere without that doll. She named it Lucy. A tear finally escaped, tracing a path down Dorothy's cheek, hot and stinging. She loved that doll more than anything. I held on to it for years after she was gone, thinking it was the only piece of her left. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. Dorothy sniffled, finally turning to face Margaret, her eyes red-rimmed. Margaret was standing utterly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face, usually so open, was a mask. Her eyes, however, held a flicker of something Dorothy couldn't quite decipher. A spark of recognition, perhaps, or a deep, unsettling surprise. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a practiced, neutral expression. Margaret's gaze dropped to the floor for a fraction of a second, then quickly lifted, a polite, almost pitying look. I'm so sorry, Miss Henderson, Margaret said, her voice a little softer than before, a subtle tremor in her usually steady tone. That sounds like a terrible burden to carry. Losing family is never easy. She picked up the proposal papers she'd brought, her movements a little stiff. Well, I'll just leave these on Carol's desk then. You have a quiet afternoon. With a small, sympathetic nod that seemed a little too knowing, Margaret turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind her. Dorothy watched her go, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. She didn't notice the lingering stillness in the room Margaret left behind, or the way Margaret's hand had unconsciously gone to her own chest as she walked away. Dorothy was too lost in the memory of a little girl, a rag doll with mismatched button eyes, and a lifetime of unanswered questions. The silence in Dorothy Henderson's office was a heavy blanket, muffling the usual city sounds from beyond her window. The latest lead had died, taking with it the fragile hope she'd clung to, leaving behind only the familiar, bitter taste of failure. She stared at the empty space on her desk where the locket had lain, a symbol of a reunion that would now never happen. The decades-long search, the millions spent, the emotional toll, it all weighed on her, a crushing burden that had finally brought her to her knees. She felt hollowed out, the fire that had fueled her for so long reduced to a few dying embers. A soft knock at the door, barely audible, pulled her from her despair. Dorothy looked up, expecting Carol, but it was Margaret Bates. She held a steaming mug in her hands, not Dorothy's usual black coffee, but a delicate porcelain cup filled with what smelled like herbal tea. Margaret's usual neat apron was still on, but her demeanor was softer, less the bustling coffee shop owner, and more a gentle presence. I hope you don't mind, Miss Henderson, Margaret said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. She didn't wait for an invitation, but stepped inside, placing the mug carefully on a coaster near Dorothy's hand. I just thought, sometimes a strong cup of tea can be more comforting than coffee when your spirit is weary. Dorothy looked at the mug, then at Margaret, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was an unexpected gesture, especially after Dorothy's recent sharp words to Carol and her dismissive tone towards Margaret herself earlier. This wasn't a business interaction, this was kindness. Margaret pulled up a chair without asking, settling herself opposite Dorothy, not invading her space, but offering a quiet, shared stillness. She didn't speak, didn't try to offer platitudes or force advice. She simply sat, her gaze calm and steady, a silent anchor in Dorothy's swirling grief. After a long moment, Dorothy finally picked up the tea. The warmth seeped into her cold hands, a small comfort. "Thank you, Margaret," she managed, her voice rough. "That's very thoughtful." Margaret nodded gently. Losing someone, especially family, is an ache that never truly leaves you, no matter how much time passes. It settles deep down, sometimes a dull throb, sometimes a sharp pang. And when you've searched so long with so much hope, well, that pain is magnified, isn't it? Her words were simple, yet they resonated with a profound understanding that none of Dorothy's private investigators, or even her closest friends, had ever quite captured. It wasn't pity Margaret offered, but a deep, quiet empathy, as if she truly understood the landscape of Dorothy's broken heart. Dorothy felt a raw knot in her throat. She looked at Margaret, truly looked at her for perhaps the first time, past the friendly coffee shop owner, past the woman who wouldn't sell her building. Margaret's face was unlined despite her years, but her eyes held a depth, a wisdom that spoke of a life lived with its own quiet battles. As Margaret spoke, a subtle gesture caught Dorothy's attention. Margaret's hand, resting lightly on her knee, had a particular way of flexing her fingers, almost an unconscious rhythmic motion, as if she were softly drumming to an unheard beat. It was a small thing, hardly noticeable, but it stirred a vague, insistent memory in Dorothy, a sense of familiarity she couldn't quite place. It wasn't a specific detail like a scar or a birthmark, but rather a characteristic movement, an echo from a time long past. The way Margaret's thumb slightly rubbed against her index finger, a soft, almost nervous habit. Dorothy felt a shiver run down her spine. Where have I seen that before? The question pulsed in her mind, vague and unformed. She watched Margaret's hand, mesmerized, a flicker of something unsettlingly familiar tickling at the edges of her memory, like a half-forgotten dream. A strange warmth spread through Dorothy's chest, not from the tea, but from this inexplicable connection she felt, observing this woman, this stranger, in a moment of quiet, shared humanity. Margaret's eyes, soft and understanding, met hers, holding a silent, patient sympathy. Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at someone she should know, someone profoundly important, though she couldn't possibly imagine why. The herbal tea had brought a small measure of warmth to Dorothy Henderson's cold hands, but the chill in her heart remained. Margaret Bates, still sitting quietly across from her, eventually rose to collect the empty mug. Her presence, however unexpected, had been a strange comfort in the echoing emptiness of Dorothy's despair. "Thank you again, Margaret," Dorothy said, her voice still hoarse. "That was truly kind." Margaret offered a small, gentle smile as she picked up the mug. "Sometimes, Ms. Henderson, we all need a little kindness, especially when the world feels too heavy to bear." She paused, glancing around the elegant office. "You know, this office building, your whole operation, it's quite a thing. So much ambition, so much drive." She chuckled softly, a wistful sound. "I guess I'm just a small-town coffee shop owner, but even I have my dreams, my little routines. Keeps me grounded, you know?" As Margaret spoke, she reached for a stray napkin on Dorothy's desk, absently folding and unfolding it with that same subtle, rhythmic movement of her fingers that Dorothy had noticed earlier. It wasn't a nervous gesture, more like a habit, a gentle tapping of her thumb against her index finger, almost like a silent counting. Dorothy watched her, a prickle of that strange familiarity returning, stronger this time. "When I was little," Margaret continued almost to herself, her eyes distant. "After a long day at the shop, when things were just hectic and overwhelming, I still sometimes find myself humming an old tune. My adoptive mom, bless her heart, used to sing it to me to calm me down. She said I was a spirited child, prone to getting upset when things didn't go just right." And then, softly, Margaret hummed, It was a delicate melody, slightly melancholic, but utterly unique. The sound wrapped around Dorothy, tightened its grip, and squeezed the breath from her lungs. The meticulous gears of Dorothy's mind, usually so sharp and precise, ground to a halt. Every sound in the office, every thought in her head, evaporated. Time stretched, then snapped. No, it couldn't be. The tune. It was a fragment of a lullaby Dorothy hadn't consciously thought of in nearly 60 years. Their mother, Alice, had sung it only to Dorothy and Maggie. A specific, almost obscure arrangement of notes that had been a secret melody between the three of them in their tiny Atlanta home. Her little bird. Dorothy felt a cold wave of shock wash over her, then a searing heat. Her body went rigid, absolutely still. Her eyes fixed on Margaret, but she wasn't seeing the coffee shop owner anymore. She was seeing a ghost from her past, a whisper from her deepest memory. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, profound silence in her own head. Margaret, seemingly oblivious to the earthquake she had just unleashed, finished humming the last few bars, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's funny, isn't it? What sticks with you from childhood? My adoptive mom told me she learned it from one of the nurses at the children's home in Atlanta when she adopted me back in '68. I was 4, and apparently I loved that song. Wouldn't sleep without hearing it." The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Children's home, Atlanta. Age 68, 4 years old. The pieces, scattered for decades across a lifetime of searching, suddenly locked into place with a terrifying, undeniable click. It wasn't just a lullaby. It wasn't just a children's home. It wasn't just Atlanta. It was all of it. Together. Her mother's journal, her endless search, the adoption details, the age, the year, all of it. Dorothy's throat felt dry, constricted. She had to ask. One question. Carefully. Casually. Her voice, when it finally came out, felt thin and reedy, a whisper she barely recognized as her own. "Margaret," Dorothy managed, trying to keep her tone even, trying to suppress the tremor that threatened to erupt through her entire body. Did your adoptive parents ever mention your birth name? Before they changed it, I mean?" Margaret, still holding the empty mug, paused, her kind eyes meeting Dorothy's. She seemed to register nothing unusual in the question, perhaps thinking it was a natural curiosity, given Dorothy's own shared stories of loss. She shrugged slightly, a faint smile. "Oh, yes, of course. They told me I came to them as Maggie. Just Maggie." "Just Maggie," Margaret repeated, her voice gentle, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in Dorothy's world. The simple word hung in the air, echoing the name Dorothy had whispered in her dreams for decades, the name scrawled in her mother's desperate journal. Dorothy's lungs felt like they couldn't pull in enough air. Her hands trembled, an invisible tremor that threatened to shake her entire body. No, this couldn't be real. Not after all this time, all the dead ends. Hope, for Dorothy, was a dangerous thing, a cruel mirage that had always led to heartbreak. But this felt different. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her face still, to maintain an air of polite curiosity. Scaring Margaret away now, after 60 years, was an unbearable thought. She had to be careful, meticulous, like an archaeologist brushing dust from an ancient, fragile artifact. "Maggie?" Dorothy repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It felt both foreign and intimately familiar. "It's a lovely name. You know," she continued, making her voice light. "My mother, bless her heart, used to tell me stories about a little girl she knew when she was young, also named Maggie. She was adopted from a children's home in Atlanta, too, a long time ago, around the same time you mentioned, actually." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of mild interest in her kind eyes. "Oh, really? What a coincidence. Small world, I suppose." She smiled faintly. It's funny how many of us adopted kids were told the same things, isn't it? Almost like a script. Dorothy's heart hammered. Coincidence or fate? She pressed on, gently, indirectly. Did your adoptive parents ever tell you much about the children's home itself? What it was like, I mean. My mother's stories often mentioned how it was a rather stark place. But I suppose it offered a roof for children in need. She watched Margaret's face, searching for any hint of recognition, any flicker of memory beyond the adopted story. Margaret tilted her head, a thoughtful expression on her face. Not much, really. Just that it was a big old brick building, not very warm, and that the nurses were kind enough, though busy. I was so young, Ms. Henderson, just 4. Most of what I remember is probably what my adoptive parents told me. They made sure I knew I was loved, right from the start. She paused, a wistful look crossing her face. My adoptive mother, she used to say I was a quiet child, but I always kept a special doll with me. Wouldn't let it go for anything. She said it made the transition easier. Dorothy felt a jolt so profound it nearly knocked the breath out of her. Her mouth went dry. The words Margaret had just spoken echoed Dorothy's own confession from Act 4, almost verbatim. A special doll. Wouldn't let it go for anything. A doll, Dorothy managed, her voice a little too high, a little too strained. What kind of doll, if you don't mind me asking? My mother's little Maggie also had a very special doll. Handmade, I believe. Very distinctive. She held her breath, every fiber of her being screaming for the answer, terrified of it at the same time. Margaret nodded, a soft smile. Oh, it wasn't fancy at all. Just a small hand-stitched rag doll. Mama made it for me. My birth mama, before everything. It had bright red yarn hair, all tangled, and the button eyes were mismatched. One bigger than the other, like it was always winking. I named her Lucy. Margaret chuckled at the memory, completely unaware of the effect her words were having. Kept her for years. Still have her, actually. Tucked away in an old photo album in the back of my shop. The world spun around Dorothy. The details. The impossible, undeniable details. Small hand-stitched rag doll, bright red yarn hair, mismatched button eyes, named Lucy. It was too much. The lullaby, the adoption, Atlanta, 1968, age 4, the birth name Maggie, and now, the doll. The exact doll her mother Alice had lovingly crafted for her baby sister. The doll Dorothy herself had cherished for years after Maggie's disappearance, believing it to be her only tangible connection. Tears, hot and sudden, sprang to Dorothy's eyes. This wasn't a dead end. This wasn't another false lead. This was real. The woman sitting across from her, the woman she had dismissed, patronized, even tried to buy out for years, the woman who brought her coffee every morning, was her sister. Her long-lost Maggie. Right here, across the alley. All this time. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave, a devastating blend of shock, guilt, and a terrifying, unbelievable joy. The search was over. It had been over for years. She just hadn't seen it. She had looked everywhere but right in front of her. The world had tilted on its axis. Dorothy Henderson stood in her opulent office, the scent of expensive leather suddenly stifling, the panoramic view of the city mocking her with its vast, indifferent sprawl. Maggie, her little bird. The girl she'd mourned and searched for across 4 states, spending millions on private investigators and genetic databases, had been right across the alley, making her coffee every single morning. The irony was a physical blow, leaving her breathless, her heart aching with a bewildering cocktail of guilt, disbelief, and a terrifying, overwhelming joy. She stumbled from her office, ignoring Carol's concerned glance from the outer desk. Her feet carried her, almost against her will, across the familiar alleyway to the daily grind. The cheerful clatter of mugs and the comforting scent of roasted coffee beans usually soothed her, but today it felt like a cruel deception. Margaret Bates was behind the counter, wiping it down with a practiced motion, a warm smile ready for the next customer. When her eyes met Dorothy's, her smile faltered. "Ms. Henderson, is everything all right?" Dorothy leaned against the doorframe, her legs feeling like jelly. Her voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible above the low hum of the coffee shop. "Margaret, you mentioned a photo album in the back with Lucy." Margaret's brows furrowed, a flicker of confusion, then concern. Dorothy's face must have betrayed the raw desperation coiling inside her. "Yes, Miss Henderson, of course. Are you looking for something in particular?" "Please," Dorothy pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, just show me." Sensing the profound urgency, Margaret hesitated only for a moment before leading Dorothy through a narrow hallway to a small, cluttered back office. Boxes of supplies were stacked high, and a faint scent of old paper lingered in the air. Margaret reached for a high shelf, her fingers brushing against a worn, leather-bound photo album. "This old thing? It's mostly just my childhood pictures. Nothing fancy." She handed it to Dorothy. Dorothy's hands trembled as she took the album. Her fingers, usually so confident in handling legal documents and architectural plans, fumbled with the clasp. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat. Page after page of smiling faces, family picnics, birthday parties. Then there it was, a faded, sepia-toned photograph tucked into a corner, its edges softened with age. In the picture, a small 4-year-old girl with bright, curious eyes and a shy smile clutched a distinctive, small, hand-stitched rag doll. The doll had bright red yarn hair, all tangled, and its button eyes were mismatched, one bigger than the other, just as Dorothy remembered, just as Maggie had described. This was Lucy, and this was Maggie, her Maggie. Tears blurred Dorothy's vision, hot and uncontrollable. She could barely see through them, but she didn't need to. The image was etched into her soul. Her fingers traced the outline of the tiny girl, her little sister, lost for so long. Then, behind the photograph, she felt a thin, brittle piece of paper. With shaking hands, Dorothy pulled it out. It was a folded, yellowed adoption certificate. It clearly bore the name Maggie, the adoption date of 1968, and the name of the children's home in Atlanta, Georgia. Every detail, every single piece of their mother's desperate journal entry confirmed. Margaret, who had been watching Dorothy with growing alarm and bewilderment, peered over her shoulder at the documents. Her eyes widened, focusing first on the name Maggie on the certificate, then on the date, then on the photograph of her younger self with Lucy. Her hand flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. The pieces, so disconnected in her own life, suddenly snapped together. The lullaby, Dorothy's detailed description of the doll, the Atlanta children's home, the year, her birth name. Her eyes, filled with a dawning, terrifying realization, slowly lifted to meet Dorothy's. "Maggie," Dorothy choked out, her voice a broken whisper, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Maggie." Margaret's own eyes filled with tears, her face a mask of shock and dawning understanding. "Dorothy," she whispered back, the name unfamiliar on her tongue, yet suddenly, profoundly right. You're my sister?" Dorothy could only nod, a profound, gut-wrenching sob tearing through her. She reached out, her hands shaking, and pulled Margaret into a fierce, desperate embrace. The search was over. All those years, all that money, the relentless, fruitless journey across states and databases. And the answer had been across the alley, serving her coffee just 3 feet away, every single morning. Pride, Arrogance and a blinding focus on the distant had kept her from seeing the precious truth right in front of her. Fate, in its mysterious way, had placed the answer where she was too blind to look, and only now, in a moment of shared, undeniable truth, had she finally stopped searching long enough to see. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.